Sometimes the quietest tears reveal the loudest truth, and on that unforgettable night, one whispered question would change two lives forever. The Moretti estate stood peacefully beneath a sky, filled with silver moonlight, its towering windows glowing warmly against the darkness, while every room reflected the elegance that had made Dominic Romano one of the most respected men in New York. Employees had already finished most of their responsibilities, and the enormous mansion had settled into the familiar silence that arrived after midnight. Dominic rarely returned home before the rest of the household had gone asleep, but an unexpected change to his schedule brought him back earlier than usual. As he walked through the long marble hallway toward his private office, something unusual interrupted the quiet rhythm of the evening. It was not the sound of breaking glass or hurried footsteps. It was softer than that. Hidden behind the gentle hum of the industrial refrigerator and the distant ticking of an antique clock came the unmistakable sound of someone trying very hard not to cry. Dominic stopped walking. He remained perfectly still, listening carefully. The sound came from the kitchen. Without making unnecessary noise, he turned and walked toward the open doorway. The enormous kitchen was illuminated only by a single hanging light above the central island, casting a warm circle across polished countertops and neatly arranged cookware. Standing beside the sink was Amara Brooks, the newest maid employed by the estate. Her broad shoulders trembled slightly as she gripped a folded dish towel with both hands. A single tear rolled quietly down her cheek before disappearing against the fabric of her uniform. She quickly wiped her face, believing she was completely alone. Dominic had met hundreds of people throughout his life, and years of experience had taught him to recognize many kinds of fear, disappointment, and exhaustion. Yet there was something different about the sadness standing before him. It was not dramatic. It asked for no attention. It carried the heavy weight of someone who had grown accustomed to suffering in silence. Amara never noticed him enter the room. She took a slow breath, straightened the neatly stacked plates on the counter, and quietly whispered to herself that tomorrow would be easier. The words were almost impossible to hear, but Dominic caught every one of them. He stepped forward just enough for the wooden floor beneath his polished shoes to produce a gentle sound. Amara immediately turned around, startled, and quickly brushed away the remaining tears before lowering her eyes with visible embarrassment. She apologized for still being awake and insisted she was only finishing her cleaning duties. Dominic studied her expression for several quiet seconds. Her face carried kindness instead of bitterness, dignity instead of anger, and an exhaustion that no ordinary workday could fully explain. He did not ask why she had been crying. He did not accuse anyone. He simply looked at her with calm sincerity and spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. Who hurt her? The question was directed as much toward himself as it was toward the silent room surrounding them, because Dominic already sensed that the answer reached far beyond a single painful moment. Amara looked confused before softly insisting that everything was fine, offering the same polite smile she gave everyone else inside the mansion. Dominic knew immediately that it was not the smile of someone without pain. It was the smile of someone who had learned to hide it. As he quietly left the kitchen without pressing her for answers, one thought remained fixed in his mind. Whatever had brought tears to the kindest eyes in his home had not happened by accident, and before another sunrise arrived, he intended to discover the truth. The following morning arrived with soft golden sunlight spilling across the towering windows of the Moretti estate, washing every polished hallway with warmth that seemed completely unaware of the quiet sorrow hidden inside the people who lived there. Dominic Romano stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private office, a cup of untouched coffee resting on the edge of his desk, while the memory of the previous night refused to leave his thoughts. He had witnessed fear before. He had seen disappointment, betrayal, and regret reflected in countless faces throughout his life. Yet the tears he had seen in Amara Brooks carried something entirely different. They belonged to someone who believed no one would ever notice her pain. That realization unsettled him far more than he cared to admit. Downstairs, the estate slowly awakened to another demanding day. Long before sunrise, Amara had already prepared fresh ingredients for breakfast, arranged serving trays with careful precision, and checked every dining table to ensure everything reflected the high standards expected inside the mansion. She moved quietly through each room with the same steady rhythm she had followed since accepting the position several months earlier. She greeted every employee with genuine kindness, offered assistance whenever someone struggled with a difficult task, and never hesitated to carry heavier boxes if it made another person's work easier. Even after the tears she had hidden only hours before, nothing about her attitude suggested bitterness. She simply continued serving others with quiet grace. Dominic watched part of the morning unfold from the second floor overlooking the grand foyer. He noticed how naturally Amara stepped aside whenever someone else needed space, how she thanked the delivery driver before signing for fresh produce, and how she smiled at an elderly groundskeeper whose hands shook while carrying gardening tools. Without saying a word, she gently lifted the heavier equipment and walked beside him until they reached the storage shed. The older man thanked her warmly. Amara only smiled and replied that everyone deserved a little help on difficult mornings. Dominic found himself wondering how someone capable of showing so much compassion could return to an empty kitchen and cry when no one was watching. As breakfast concluded, several members of the household gathered briefly near the service hallway before beginning their next assignments. Amara entered carrying a neatly folded stack of fresh linens. The conversation stopped for only a moment before polite smiles appeared across several faces. She greeted everyone warmly and continued toward the laundry room without sensing the quiet glances exchanged behind her back. The instant she disappeared around the corner, faint laughter drifted through the hallway. One employee casually remarked that the uniform department probably ordered extra fabric whenever Amara needed new work clothes. Another suggested the kitchen inventory disappeared faster now that she worked nearby. A few people laughed softly while others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. None of them noticed Dominic standing farther down the corridor, partially hidden behind the archway leading toward his office. He had not heard every sentence, but he had heard enough. More importantly, he had seen the expressions that followed. There was no anger on the faces before him, only casual amusement, as though humiliating another human being had quietly become part of the daily routine. Dominic said nothing. He simply turned and walked away before anyone realized he had been there. Inside his office, he slowly closed the door and looked once more across the estate grounds stretching beyond the windows. Reports could describe efficiency. Schedules could measure productivity. Neither could reveal the true character of the people responsible for maintaining his home. The question he had whispered the previous night had not disappeared. Instead, it had become heavier with every passing hour. Someone had slowly been breaking the spirit of the kindest woman in the mansion, and the silence surrounding that truth had lasted far too long. Dominic quietly reached for the telephone on his desk and instructed the estate manager to prepare complete personnel records for every household employee before the end of the day. He intended to learn far more than names and job titles, because the truth always revealed itself to those patient enough to keep watching. The personnel files arrived before sunset, neatly organized inside a black leather folder that revealed years of employment history, performance reviews, attendance records, and supervisor comments. Dominic Romano read every page carefully, expecting to discover complaints, disciplinary actions, or evidence that might explain the sadness he had witnessed. Inside the kitchen, instead, the documents painted a remarkably different picture. Every evaluation described Amara Brooks using nearly identical words: reliable, respectful, hardworking, patient, cooperative. She had never arrived late. She had never argued with another employee. She had willingly accepted extra responsibilities whenever unexpected events placed additional pressure on the household. One supervisor even noted that Amara regularly volunteered to help co-workers finish difficult assignments before returning to complete her own tasks. Dominic slowly closed the folder, realizing that paperwork could measure performance while remaining completely blind to character. Nothing in those reports explained why someone admired for her work had stood alone wiping away tears after midnight. The following afternoon brought another formal luncheon attended by several longtime business associates. As always, the household staff moved quietly through the estate, ensuring every guest experienced flawless service. Amara carried serving trays with steady confidence despite their weight, carefully placing each dish before the guests with genuine warmth and professional courtesy. She remembered every dietary preference without consulting written notes and thanked each guest with the same sincere smile before returning to the kitchen. Most visitors barely noticed her beyond polite appreciation. A few employees noticed something entirely different. Near the service entrance connecting the dining room to the kitchen, two staff members watched Amara disappear around the corner before exchanging amused smiles. One quietly joked that expensive kitchens probably felt much smaller whenever she worked inside them. Another laughed softly and replied that at least no one needed to worry about leftovers when Amara was nearby. Their words were spoken casually, almost effortlessly, as though repeating jokes that had already become familiar. A third employee lowered her eyes uncomfortably but remained silent, choosing safety over courage. None of them realized Dominic had stepped into the hallway after excusing himself briefly from the luncheon to answer an important telephone call. He heard only the final remarks, yet the expressions on their faces told him everything the missing sentences could not. The laughter disappeared instantly when they noticed him standing only a few feet away. One employee quickly pretended to organize serving utensils, while another hurried back toward the dining room without saying a word. Dominic never raised his voice. He simply looked at each person long enough for the silence itself to become uncomfortable before calmly continuing down the hallway. Moments later, he reached the kitchen doorway, where Amara quietly arranged dessert plates with the same gentle focus she brought to every responsibility. She had clearly heard nothing. Her attention remained fixed on making certain each plate looked perfect before leaving the room. Dominic watched unnoticed as she paused to help a nervous young kitchen assistant who had accidentally dropped several forks onto the floor. Instead of allowing the younger employee to panic, Amara knelt beside her, smiled reassuringly, and helped gather every piece of silverware before reminding her that everyone made small mistakes while learning. The assistant visibly relaxed. Dominic understood something important in that simple moment. The woman who received the least kindness inside his own home continued offering the greatest kindness to everyone around her. There was no resentment in her actions, no bitterness hidden behind polite words, only quiet dignity that refused to disappear despite repeated disrespect. As the luncheon came to an end and the final guests departed, Dominic remained standing beside the tall dining room windows watching the household slowly return to its normal routine. The truth no longer felt distant or uncertain. It had begun revealing itself through ordinary moments that everyone else had stopped noticing. Someone had mistaken Amara's silence for weakness, while failing to recognize that real strength often speaks the least. Dominic quietly made another decision. From that day forward, he would stop relying on reports and begin paying closer attention to the people themselves, because the greatest truths inside any home are almost never written on paper. The next morning unfolded with unusual calm, yet beneath the polished elegance of the Moretti estate, quiet tension lingered where no visitor could ever see it. Dominic Romano had already reached a conclusion that required no emotion and no assumptions. He needed facts, not rumors, not excuses. Facts. Shortly after sunrise, he instructed the estate manager to arrange a mandatory meeting for every household employee before the day's responsibilities officially began. The announcement spread quickly through the mansion, leaving cooks, drivers, gardeners, housekeepers, and maintenance staff exchanging uncertain glances as they quietly gathered inside the grand library. Meetings involving every employee were exceptionally rare, and no one understood why Dominic himself had requested this one. Amara Brooks entered with the rest of the staff, taking her usual place near the back of the room. She hoped the meeting would be brief, so everyone could return to work. The possibility that it had anything to do with her never entered her mind. Dominic entered exactly on schedule. His expression remained composed, his voice calm, and his posture reflected the same quiet confidence that had earned respect throughout every part of his professional life. He thanked everyone for their dedication before allowing several seconds of complete silence to settle across the room. A beautiful home is measured by more than polished floors and perfect service, he finally said. It is measured by the way people treat one another when they believe no one important is watching. The words immediately changed the atmosphere. Several employees instinctively lowered their eyes while others shifted uncomfortably without understanding why. Dominic continued speaking without raising his voice. I believe every person deserves the opportunity to tell the truth without fear. He nodded toward the estate manager, who immediately distributed identical envelopes to every employee. Inside each envelope rested a blank sheet of paper. Dominic explained that everyone would have 10 minutes to write anonymously about the culture inside the estate, including whether they had witnessed disrespect, humiliation, or behavior inconsistent with the values expected inside his home. No names were required. No signatures would appear. Every response would remain confidential. The room fell completely silent except for the quiet sound of pens touching paper. Some employees began writing immediately. Others stared at the blank page for several minutes before finally lowering their pens. Amara held the paper gently between both hands, but could not bring herself to write a single sentence. She had never wanted revenge against anyone. Even after everything she had quietly endured, she believed kindness should never become another form of punishment. When the allotted time ended, the envelopes were collected without anyone reading them aloud. Dominic thanked everyone for their honesty and dismissed the meeting without offering further explanation. Employees quietly returned to their responsibilities, whispering uncertainly as they disappeared into different wings of the estate. Amara walked back toward the kitchen believing the strange gathering had already accomplished whatever purpose it served. She never imagined that several anonymous letters now resting inside Dominic's study described the very pain she had worked so hard to hide. Alone behind the closed door of his office, Dominic carefully opened the first envelope. Then another. Then another. Different handwriting repeated the same uncomfortable truth. Several employees admitted that jokes about Amara's appearance had become common. Others confessed they had witnessed the behavior countless times, but remained silent because speaking up felt inconvenient. One sentence stopped Dominic completely. She always helped the people who laughed at her. He slowly placed the page back onto his desk and stared through the tall windows overlooking the quiet estate. The truth had finally revealed itself, not through accusations, but through the guilty conscience of those who had watched kindness suffer while saying nothing at all. The anonymous letters remained spread across Dominic Romano's desk long after the sun had disappeared beyond the towering oak trees surrounding the estate. One by one, he read every page a second time, searching for inconsistency, exaggeration, or contradiction. Instead, each letter quietly confirmed the next. Different employees described the same painful pattern from different perspectives. Some admitted they had laughed simply because everyone else had laughed. Others confessed they had remained silent because they feared becoming the next target of careless jokes. One employee wrote that Amara Brooks had quietly comforted her after a difficult family emergency, even though only hours earlier that same employee had stood nearby while others mocked Amara's appearance. Another admitted that Amara often volunteered to finish the most physically demanding assignments without complaint, allowing older co-workers to rest, yet she never received the same kindness in return. Dominic slowly leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a brief moment. The truth no longer required investigation. It required responsibility. The following afternoon, Dominic reviewed security footage from the common work areas inside the estate, not because he doubted the letters, but because he wanted to understand the full picture before taking action. The recordings revealed no dramatic confrontation and no obvious act of cruelty. Instead, they showed something far more disturbing. Small moments repeated day after day. Quiet smiles exchanged after Amara walked away. Meaningful glances followed by restrained laughter. Conversations that stopped the moment she returned. She never reacted. She simply continued carrying fresh towels, organizing supplies, serving meals, and helping everyone around her as though she had chosen not to let unkindness change the person she wanted to become. Dominic watched one recording where a young kitchen assistant accidentally dropped an entire tray of clean dishes onto the floor. The frightened employee immediately apologized, expecting criticism. Before anyone else reached the scene, Amara calmly knelt beside her, assuring the young woman that accidents happen to everyone. Together, they carefully cleaned the area before preparing a new set of dishes without a single complaint. Dominic noticed something that made the moment even more remarkable. Only minutes before helping that employee, Amara had quietly overheard another hurtful comment directed toward her appearance. She could have walked away. She could have ignored the situation. Instead, She chose compassion without hesitation. Dominic understood then that kindness had become part of her character rather than a response to how she was treated. As evening settled across the mansion, Dominic walked through the kitchen where Amara was preparing fresh bread for the following morning. She greeted him with the same warm smile she offered every member of the household, never expecting special attention because of the previous day's meeting. Dominic thanked her for another day of excellent work before asking whether she had everything she needed to perform her responsibilities comfortably. Amara looked genuinely surprised by the simple question before quietly answering that she did. She even thanked him for asking, although no employer had ever asked her that before. After Dominic left the kitchen, he paused briefly in the hallway. The woman who had been shown the least respect inside his own home remained the first person to express gratitude for ordinary kindness. That realization stayed with him as he returned to his study. Before ending the evening, Dominic instructed the estate manager to gather every employee once again the following morning. This meeting would be different. The investigation had ended. Excuses no longer mattered. The Moretti estate had spent too long allowing dignity to disappear in silence, and Dominic intended to make certain that when the next sunrise arrived, every person working beneath his roof would understand one truth that could never again be ignored. Respect would no longer depend upon appearance, position, or popularity. It would become the standard by which everyone inside the estate would be measured. The following morning began beneath a bright autumn sky, yet an unmistakable seriousness settled over the Moretti estate long before breakfast was served. Every employee arrived at the Grand Library several minutes early, quietly taking their seats while exchanging uncertain glances. Word had already spread that Dominic Romano had personally requested another gathering. No one knew what he intended to say, but everyone sensed that the meeting would mark an important turning point. Amara Brooks entered with the rest of the household staff, carrying the same calm expression she wore every day. She hoped the meeting would end quickly so everyone could return to their responsibilities. She still believed the anonymous letters had concerned the estate in general rather than her personally. Dominic entered exactly on time and stood near the large windows overlooking the gardens. He thanked every employee for attending before allowing complete silence to settle throughout the room. When he finally spoke, his voice remained steady and composed. "Yesterday, I asked each of you for honesty," he said quietly. "Many of you showed remarkable courage. Some admitted mistakes. Others admitted something even more difficult. They admitted that they watched another person suffer and convinced themselves that remaining silent was easier than speaking with kindness." No one interrupted. Several employees lowered their eyes toward the polished wooden floor. Dominic continued without anger. "Over the past several days, I have reviewed every report available to me. I have read every anonymous letter. I have personally observed the way people interact inside this house. The conclusion is no longer uncertain." He paused briefly before asking one simple question that echoed through the silent library. Why was the person who offered the greatest kindness treated with the least respect? The room became completely still. One senior housekeeper slowly stepped forward, her voice trembling as she admitted that hurtful jokes about Amara's appearance had continued for months. She confessed that she never participated directly, yet she had also never stopped the behavior when she could have. Another employee quietly apologized for laughing because joining the group had seemed easier than standing alone. One confession encouraged another until several members of the staff acknowledged choices they deeply regretted. Throughout every apology, Amara remained frozen with quiet disbelief. She had never expected anyone to defend her, and she certainly had never imagined hearing people openly accept responsibility for the pain they had caused. Dominic listened patiently until the final voice faded into silence. Only then did he speak again. "Respect cannot depend upon appearance. It cannot depend upon position. It cannot depend upon popularity. If dignity belongs only to certain people, then it belongs to no one at all." His words were calm, yet every sentence carried unmistakable conviction. Dominic then turned toward Amara for the first time since the meeting began. "Your work has always reflected excellence," he said sincerely. "More importantly, your character has reflected compassion even when compassion was not returned. That is the standard this estate will follow from this day forward." Amara quietly shook her head, insisting she did not want anyone humiliated because of her. Dominic answered with a gentle smile. This meeting is not about humiliation. It is about making certain that kindness never stands alone again. He then announced several permanent changes. Every employee would receive training centered upon workplace respect. New reporting procedures would protect anyone experiencing mistreatment, and every supervisor would be held personally responsible for maintaining a culture of dignity throughout the estate. No applause followed the announcement. None was necessary. As the meeting ended, employees approached Amara one by one with sincere apologies, not because they had been ordered to do so, but because they finally understood the quiet cost of their silence. For the first time since arriving at the Moretti estate, Amara walked through the library without lowering her eyes, and everyone present understood that the greatest victory that morning was not authority enforcing rules. It was dignity finally receiving the respect it had deserved all along. The days that followed brought a quiet transformation that no renovation could ever accomplish. The marble floors remained polished, the crystal chandeliers still reflected morning sunlight, and the gardens continued blooming with careful precision. Yet every person working inside the Moretti estate sensed that something far more important had changed. The atmosphere no longer felt divided by whispered judgment or silent hesitation. Instead, respect gradually became as natural as the daily routine itself. Dominic Romano never reminded anyone about the meeting in the library. He believed true change could never be forced through repeated warnings. It had to grow through daily choices. From his office overlooking the estate, he began paying closer attention to moments most people considered ordinary. He noticed employees greeting one another by name instead of simply walking past each other. He watched experienced staff members patiently helping new employees without frustration. The quiet laughter echoing through the hallways no longer carried cruelty hidden beneath polite smiles. It carried something entirely different. It sounded genuine. Amara Brooks continued living exactly as she always had. She arrived before dawn, organized the kitchen before breakfast, prepared fresh flowers for the dining room, and offered help whenever another employee struggled beneath a demanding workload. Nothing about her routine changed because she had never worked hard for recognition. She simply believed every task deserved her best effort regardless of who happened to notice. One afternoon, an older housekeeper accidentally strained her shoulder while lifting a heavy storage container. Before anyone else reacted, Amara calmly walked over, lifted the container herself, and encouraged the older woman to rest while she finished organizing the supplies. The housekeeper quietly apologized for needing assistance. Amara smiled warmly and answered that accepting help sometimes required just as much strength as offering it. Standing near the hallway entrance, Dominic observed the entire exchange without interrupting. He realized that even after everything she had endured, Amara had never allowed disappointment to harden her heart. That evening, the estate welcomed several respected community leaders for a charitable fundraising dinner. The event required flawless coordination, and every employee worked together with remarkable efficiency. As guests complimented the elegance of the evening, one longtime family friend remarked that Dominic appeared fortunate to have assembled such an exceptional household staff. Dominic looked around the beautifully decorated dining room before quietly replying, "The finest quality inside this home cannot be measured by service alone. It is measured by the character of the people who serve beside one another." His words were simple, yet several employees standing nearby quietly understood exactly whom he meant. Later, after the guests departed, the estate manager approached Dominic with an unexpected observation. Staff members had recently begun volunteering to exchange shifts whenever someone faced a family emergency or personal difficulty. The idea had not been requested by management. It had simply appeared on its own. Dominic asked what had inspired the change. The manager smiled gently before answering. People watched one person continue choosing kindness even when kindness was never guaranteed. Eventually, they realized they wanted to become more like her. Dominic remained silent for several thoughtful moments. Leadership had taught him that policies could improve behavior, but only example could truly transform character. Looking through the kitchen doorway, he saw Amara quietly wiping the final countertop before switching off the lights, unaware that anyone had been watching. She still carried herself with the same humility she possessed on the first day she arrived at the estate. The difference was no longer found within her. The difference surrounded her. For the first time, She walked through the mansion without invisible judgment following every step, and everyone who witnessed that quiet transformation understood a truth they would never forget. Genuine respect is never created by fear. It grows naturally wherever ordinary people choose compassion over convenience, courage over silence, and dignity over appearances. Several weeks passed, and the quiet changes inside the Moretti estate continued to grow in ways that no one could have predicted. The grand mansion still reflected wealth and elegance, but visitors who returned after several months often sensed something different without being able to explain it. The atmosphere felt lighter. Employees smiled more naturally. Conversations carried warmth instead of cautious politeness. The transformation had never been announced through expensive renovations or public speeches. It had begun with one simple decision to protect the dignity of a person who believed she would always remain invisible. Amara Brooks never considered herself responsible for any of those changes. She continued waking before sunrise, preparing breakfast, organizing supplies, and helping anyone who needed assistance without expecting recognition. She still thanked delivery drivers by name, still remembered birthdays for coworkers, and still quietly placed homemade cookies in the staff lounge every Friday afternoon without telling anyone who had baked them. Most people only discovered the truth because they recognized the familiar recipe after tasting them. One afternoon, the estate manager received a telephone call from the director of a neighborhood community center organizing its annual volunteer appreciation evening. Several local organizations had independently submitted nominations recognizing individuals whose quiet acts of kindness had positively influenced the lives of others throughout the year. To everyone's surprise, Amara's name appeared repeatedly among those nominations. The recommendations had come from several employees working at the estate, a local grocery store manager who often watched her purchase extra food for struggling families, and the elderly groundskeeper whose difficult days she had quietly made easier with consistent compassion. None of those people knew the others had submitted her name. They had simply chosen to describe the same generous woman from different parts of her life. When the estate manager shared the invitation with Dominic Romano, he read every nomination carefully before setting the papers aside with a quiet smile. None of the letters praised Amara for extraordinary achievements. Instead, they described ordinary moments performed with extraordinary kindness. One person wrote that she never allowed anyone to eat lunch alone. Another remembered how she quietly paid for winter coats after learning that a co-worker's children had outgrown theirs. Someone else described the countless mornings she encouraged people who doubted themselves before beginning another demanding day. Dominic realized that the same qualities transforming his own home had quietly touched an entire community beyond the estate walls. Amara reluctantly agreed to attend the appreciation evening only after several coworkers insisted that declining the invitation would disappoint the people who had taken time to honor her. She arrived wearing a simple navy blue dress and the same humble smile she carried every day. When her name was announced as the recipient of the Community Heart Award, she looked around in complete disbelief before slowly walking toward the stage. The audience stood together in warm applause that seemed to last much longer than she believed she deserved. Accepting the crystal plaque with both hands, Amara thanked everyone for their kindness before sharing only a few quiet words. "People remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you say," she said softly. "If someone leaves my presence feeling respected, then I have already received the greatest reward I could ever ask for." The theater fell completely silent before another wave of heartfelt applause filled the room. Standing quietly near the back, Dominic watched without interrupting the moment. He understood that no title, position, or influence could have earned the respect Amara had just received. She had earned it through thousands of unseen choices made when no applause had ever been waiting. As they left the theater beneath the gentle glow of the evening lights, Dominic realized that kindness always leaves footprints, even when the person creating them never turns around to see how many lives have quietly chosen to follow. Autumn slowly settled across the Moretti estate, covering the gardens with golden leaves that danced gently through the cool morning breeze, while sunlight poured across the same kitchen where everything had quietly begun. Months had passed since the night Dominic Romano heard tears hidden behind silence, yet that simple moment continued shaping every corner of the home. New employees who joined the household quickly noticed something unusual. They found a place where every greeting carried sincerity, every question was answered with patience, and every person, regardless of position, received the same measure of respect. They assumed the atmosphere had always been that way. Only those who had witnessed the difficult days understood how much courage it had taken to create such lasting change. Amara Brooks remained exactly the woman she had always been. She still arrived before dawn, still prepared breakfast with careful attention, still remembered everyone's favorite morning coffee, and still quietly offered help before anyone asked for it. Recognition had never changed her because recognition had never been the reason she chose kindness. One crisp Saturday morning, Dominic entered the kitchen earlier than usual and found Amara removing fresh cinnamon rolls from the oven, their warm aroma filling the room with comforting sweetness. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked around the peaceful kitchen where fear had once lived unnoticed. Dominic finally smiled and said that the room felt different now. Amara glanced toward the window where golden leaves drifted softly beyond the glass before answering with gentle honesty. She said the kitchen had not changed because of new furniture or new rules. It had changed because people no longer felt afraid to be themselves. Dominic quietly nodded, realizing that those simple words described the entire journey more clearly than any speech ever could. Later that afternoon, the estate hosted a modest harvest gathering for every employee and their families. Long wooden tables filled the garden beneath strands of warm lights. Children laughed while playing across the lawn, and co-workers who once barely spoke now shared homemade food and heartfelt conversations. There were no formal guests and no business discussions. It was simply a celebration of the people who made the estate feel like home. Before the meal began, Dominic stood to thank everyone for another successful season. His remarks were brief, but every person listened carefully. He said that buildings become impressive through wealth, but homes become unforgettable through the character of the people living inside them. He added that true leadership is never measured by the number of people who obey, but by the number of people who feel safe, respected, and valued because someone chose to care. As he returned to his seat, his eyes briefly met Amara's, and no further explanation was necessary. She understood the gratitude behind his quiet expression, while Dominic understood that the greatest lesson of his life had come from the person who had expected nothing in return. As evening settled over the estate, Amara stepped into the kitchen one last time before going home. She paused beside the sink where she had once struggled to hide silent tears and looked around the peaceful room, filled with warmth instead of loneliness. The memory no longer brought sadness. It reminded her how one act of genuine compassion could change countless lives. Outside, Dominic watched the glowing kitchen windows from the garden and reflected upon everything that had happened since that unforgettable night. He had believed influence came from authority, experience, and reputation. Amara had quietly shown him that the greatest influence always begins with simple human dignity. The wind gently carried autumn leaves across the stone pathway as laughter echoed from the garden behind him. And in that quiet moment, everyone who called the Moretti estate home understood a truth that would remain long after every season changed. Respect freely given becomes the strongest foundation any heart, any family, and any home will ever know.